So this month's theme, as we begin the new year with all sorts of new things going on, if you are on your adoption journey and you have not yet joined our brand new Facebook group run by our brand new team member, Lindsay McKenzie, who is our community outreach coordinator, please go join that group right now. It's an amazing, safe space to build community with other people that are going through the process as well. And it's called the Adoption Roadmap, something, something, something about community and education. It's growing fast, so go get in there right now. I hear my son playing video games downstairs, so hopefully he won't disrupt. The theme for this month, as we kick off a new year, is open adoption. And I haven't sent out my weekly email now because I said, stop the presses. We need to start from the very beginning. What is open adoption? And a little bit of a historical overview. So I started reading this study by the Eben B. Donaldson Adoption Institute. Now, it's from 2012 because unfortunately they don't do these studies very often. It's really complicated and time consuming, but this is fascinating. So please allow me, hello Megs, Happy New Year. Please indulge me in letting me read some of this to you. And maybe you'll find it as fascinating as I do. So keep in mind, this is from 2012, which is really the most recent study that's been done. Okay. So let's see. It says a historical perspective. Most adoptions, I won't read everything, but I'm going to read some of this stuff because I was like, oh my God, tell me more. Most adoptions throughout history have been open to varying degrees, and most have taken place informally within extended families. Okay. The legal process of adoption, in which the rights and responsibilities of one parent is transferred to another, is a phenomenon of modern Western countries. Secrecy was not a part of the original statutes passed across the U.S. between 1851 and 1929. In fact, most states did not even begin sealing adopted children's original birth certificates until the 1930s through the 1950s. Even then, the documents were closed to the public, but not to the affected parties. Interesting. So the practice of sealing original birth certificates to everyone became common only in the middle of the 20th century. Indeed, some states did not do so until 1970 through 1990, and 2 states never sealed these documents, both Kansas and Alaska. Bravo to them. Mandating secrecy was a well-intended effort to protect children born out of wedlock from the stigma of being branded illegitimate. The U.S. Children's Bureau in 1941 approved the practice, which continues today, of creating, and a lot of that has been overturned now, thankfully, but just as of recently, of creating, let's see, in 1941, the U.S. Children's Bureau approved the practice of creating new birth certificates on which the adoptive parents were listed as the birth parents, in part so the children could avoid the embarrassment of explaining why their parents' names differed from those on their original birth certificates. I don't know about you, but how many of you even look at your birth certificates? But regardless, crazy, right? In that era, lawmakers and social workers created policies and procedures to prevent birth and adoptive family members from having any contact with or identifying knowledge about each other. So there were policies made that made it so you could not have contact. Many believed that a person had no need to know that she or he was adopted and no need for ongoing genetic or medical information. Where that belief came from, I don't know. The commonly accepted view was that adopted persons could simply take on their adoptive parents' family history and heritage, and be raised exactly as if they'd been born to the adult raising them. Differences between families formed by birth or by adoption just simply were not acknowledged. Crazy. Women who were pregnant and unmarried in the mid-20th century often were pressured by their families, by their doctors, by clergy and others to quote unquote do the right thing for themselves and their children through adoption. It was believed at the time that this would enable them to put the relinquishment experience behind them, forget about the child, and just move on with their lives as if they had experienced no loss at all. Now, we all know that this is all baloney. I mean, it's crazy that people thought this way. Like, how could somebody think that a child, like all this secrecy was healthy for the child? Anyway, secrecy was supposed to benefit birth parents. And they basically were not allowed to publicly express sorrow or regret. Can you imagine what that did to a birth parent regarding their decision to place their baby? They couldn't express their feelings. Okay, somebody tell me that. Prevailing thought was that cutting birth parents completely out of the child's life would empower adoptive parents in their parental role and help them bond more securely with their child, free of the fear that birth parents would ever intrude in their lives. And I know that there are still some people that wish that it was like that today, because there's this whole myth, and we know it to be a myth now, that birth parents are going to come and show up at your door and knock and say, I want my baby back. It doesn't happen. Adopted individuals who wanted information, okay, so now that was all protecting the birth parents and the adoptive parents. Now, adopted individuals who wanted information about their biological origins were often viewed as, oh, I gotta breathe through this one. This whole thing, like thank God things have changed. So they were viewed, if they wanted any information, as psychologically maladjusted, perhaps because some failure on the adoptive parents' part. It was thought that adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents would be psychologically harmed if they contacted each other. Each other. I mean, yeah. Beginning in the 1970s, when I grew up, yes, I am that old, birth parents emerged from the shadows, thank goodness, to declare that the secrecy designed to protect them had instead oppressed and hurt them. Thank the good Lord. They explained that they had not asked for or needed secrecy, rather absolute secrecy was imposed on them as a condition of the adoption. Brian finds it interesting too. It's so fascinating. Secrecy left many, if not most of them, frustrated, plagued with unanswered questions, and trying to deal with unresolved grief and loss. Well, duh. Awareness began to grow that laws, agency policies, and adoption practices requiring secrecy and the severing of contact were disempowering and had deleterious, that's a new word, medical and emotional consequences, basically, duh. An extensive literature describing the ill effects of closed confidential adoptions emerged in the 1970s. So this is interesting. Okay. So now in the 1970s, birth moms were like, this is BS. Adopted individuals, they started to have a voice too, began to describe in detail the damaging effects that secrecy had on them. Some reported thinking that there was something so terribly shameful about their origins or about themselves that it had to be kept hidden. Well, yeah. And this is why you need to create space also within your households to talk about it and to have these conversations. Many adopted people describe nagging unanswered questions on a range of issues, from the reason for their adoption and their family history to whether they might unwittingly date a biological relative or die from a genetic condition. And I know that that's still a concern by many people who were raised in a closed adoption from a long time ago. They felt an important piece of themselves was missing and expressed frustration and powerlessness that they did not have the same rights as everyone else to access their own information, notably their original birth certificates. So that fight started in the 1970s, and you guys, states are just opening birth certificates. Some still haven't. But thank God it's happening, and thank God it only took, 50 years for something to be done. It's nuts. As they witnessed their children's pain, anger, and frustration, many adoptive parents felt disempowered. So now the adoptive parents are also saying, you know what? We feel disempowered by our ability to reasonably answer our child's questions about their origins and who they are. A growing number also wanted to meet the children's birth parents for numerous reasons, from gaining a better understanding of their children's background to assuring the birth parents that the children were well and expressing gratitude. I don't love this wording, but for the gift of parenthood. Others wanted to connect their children to their first mothers, siblings, and other relatives, simply thinking it was the right thing to do. So there's always some good people in the mix, but the thinking back then was, it's evolved so much. Starting in the late 1960s, the number of women placing their newborns for adoption began to decline sharply for 3 reasons. 1, an easing of the stigma against unwed motherhood. So even back in the 1960s, that's interesting because I didn't think it happened that early. The advent of legalized abortion, okay, that makes sense, and the growing access to contraception. That makes sense too. It became increasingly clear that most women didn't want secrecy or a cutoff from information or contact when placing their children for adoption. So they said, basically, you know what? I don't have to do this anymore. I don't want to give up my child and never have access to that anymore. And they started speaking up, or parents started speaking up. Indeed, the fewer and fewer infants available, the forces with fewer and fewer, the forces of supply and demand provided expectant parents considering adoption more of a say. They became increasingly involved and vocal in choosing who would adopt their children and what kind, if any, of ongoing contact the birth and adoptive families might have. So this concept of openness started trickling a little bit in the late 1960s and early 70s. And at that time also, agencies were also experiencing growing numbers of adopted persons and birth parents returning to seek information. So some of those agencies started offering expectant parents and prospective adoptive parents alternatives to total secrecy. They began to facilitate sending pictures of children to birth parents, letting expectant parents choose the adoptive parents, and arranging for birth and adoptive parents to meet without sharing identifying information. And lo and behold, guess what happened? They got positive responses to these initial changes. And slowly, more openness started to emerge, including all the parents exchanging letters and pictures through the agency, which is sometimes called mediated adoption. So all the parents meeting each other and sharing and identifying information, that was another form, and also ongoing contact between the involved parties. So exchanging information and being more open. And over time, the benefits of open adoption have become more apparent, and as a consequence, the number of such adoptions have steadily grown. Now we're in the 1980s. In the 1980s, something interesting happened. Some professionals started decreeing that open adoption was a grave mistake. And in response, studies were launched to track experiences of open adoptions participants and learn from their experiences. Research related to communication about adoption also indicates that parents often underestimate the difficulty their children have in talking about adoption, as well as the reality that the level of communicative openness can vary between a child and each parent, as well as across different adopted children in the same family. Okay, so that's obvious. So, I mean, talking about it is not an easy thing. And each level of openness and each family is structured very different. And each open adoption will look very different. I won't go on and read anymore, but I think it's just very interesting to see how far we've come, because my venture, and I know in the study it said about, and this was in 2012, I think it said, and it's in our weekly email today, I don't remember, but something like 90% or 70, some high number, maybe it's 75% of adoptions were open. I think that there's no such thing as a closed adoption anymore. And I think most of my colleagues out there would agree. Even if an expectant mother or birth mother starts out wanting to close a closed adoption with technology and DNA tests and all of that, eventually if somebody wants to find out information, they will. But thankfully, what we are seeing with most of our families, even the ones that come in scared about open adoption, which I'll admit I was too, and there's a lot more information out there now about open adoption. It's becoming way more normalized than even when I adopted 9 years ago. And now beautiful relationships are being made and created, and it can be a beautiful thing. And birth parents can be assured that they made the right decision, and continue to know what's happening in their child's life. Adoptees can have information about their origins and who they are, and have that ongoing relationship if they so choose and if it's healthy. But as we go on throughout the month, we're going to talk more and more about what types of open adoption relationships look like and how to best navigate those relationships. And we're going to provide tools and conversation and education. I'm so glad I sat down and really read these words, because wow, it's so interesting, the language and the thought process of professionals, right? Thank you all for listening in, indulging me. Happy New Year again. I hope we have a great start to the year. And if you have any questions about open adoption, please have them come, ask them. Talk to you later. Have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy. Don't let your guard down now. Vaccines are out, but I know about 5 people with COVID right now. Stay strong. The light is at the end of the tunnel. Bye, guys. Mwah. Have a good weekend.